It's no use crying over spilled milk. Russia's situation in Ukraine can only be summarized with these words. Since the beginning of the war, Russia has lost more than 110,000 soldiers in total. Nevertheless, the Moscow administration does not give up on adopting policies in favor of increasing the violence and tension of the war. However, the Ukrainian armed forces' dominance of the war, especially after the New Year's Eve, managed to rein in this aggressive attitude of the Russians. This week, the front lines again witnessed multi-directional and critical clashes, explosions, and breathtaking offensive operations. Let's go to the southern front line of Ukraine, which is our first stop. In recent days, the Ukrainians have stepped up their attempts to reduce the number of Russian soldiers in this region. You may remember that the Russians sent many troops from Berdyansk to Tokmak and Melitopol. The activity in Tokmak already indicated an offensive operation. Russian soldiers concentrated on attacks against Ukrainian forces on this front line. However, the latest situation in Tokmak has now passed under the control of the Ukrainian forces after the attacks of these invading troops were repulsed. The Ukrainian army built quite solid defensive fortifications here. Unable to find what they expected in Tokmak, the Russian troops moved towards the Fedorivka settlement near the Dnieper River. It is claimed that some Moscow army soldiers who escaped from Tokmak came to the Russian base in Chulakivka. The Russian base in this region is far from the active front lines of the war such as Melitopol, Tokmak and Kherson. However, as the Ukrainian Air Force is capable of targeting the Russian base in Chulakivka in any way, activity in this region attracted attention yesterday. The Kiev forces pursued the Russian soldiers fleeing Tokmak and attacked the Russian base in Chulakivka. According to the report published by the Ukrainian General Staff, it was reported that the Moscow army lost 500 soldiers after the attack on the military base in this region. Most of those killed at the Russian base at Chulakivka were newly mobilized soldiers. These soldiers were sent to the active Ukrainian front after completing their training for a very short time in the camps in Russia. On the Kherson front line, the military successes of the Ukrainian forces in the last few days draw attention. Yesterday on this front line, the news of a shocking explosion has alarmed local residents. The Ukrainian armed forces conducted a striking offensive operation on the base of the Russian occupation forces in Havrylivka Druha in the Kherson region. These attacks also affected the Tavrida factory located near the Russian military base. In the early hours of yesterday morning, a very violent explosion occurred at Havrylivka Druha in the Kherson region. The village of Havrylivka Druha is located on the westernmost of the three main highways from Kherson to the Crimea. This village is only about 10 kilometers from Crimea, and the attack range of the Ukrainian forces easily exceeds it. It is reported that in the dormitory of the military base of the Moscow army in this region, there are about 1,000 Russian soldiers in total. The presence of so many Russian soldiers at the military base after the violent explosion increased the fear and anxiety for the Moscow administration even more, because in recent weeks, as we mentioned, the Ukrainian forces have been carrying out offensive operations against the bases where the Russian soldiers are concentrated. Havrylivka Druha was also one of the military bases where there was such concentration of soldiers. The explosions at this military base started at 5 a.m. and the windows of the nearby houses were smashed due to the intensity of the explosions. Dozens of emergency response teams were dispatched to the area where the attack took place. Due to the presence of 1,000 Russian soldiers in the base area, the Moscow administration tried not to reflect the attack on the media. But the first hot data from the explosion area indicated that more than 50 Russian soldiers were killed at the moment. In addition, 100 Russian soldiers were injured in these explosions. While the number of soldiers killed in the base area cannot be fully confirmed at this time, it would not be a surprise that the number will increase over time. It is quite normal for the Moscow administration to try to hide these attacks. You remember the fiasco in Makivka? Russia had lost almost 500 soldiers in this region. Now, a similar incident took place at the Russian military base in Havrylivka Druha. By the way, if you have noticed, in recent days, on all the front lines in Ukraine, military bases and ammunition depots of Russian troops are constantly being blown up by Kiev forces. Russian military areas, first in Makivka and then in Statova, are some of the military areas that were blown up as a result of the striking operations by the Ukrainian armed forces. And the interesting thing is that, thanks to this new attack method, Ukraine managed to neutralize 500 Russian soldiers in Makivka and another 400 in Statova. The reason why the Russians suffered heavy losses in these attacks is that the areas targeted by the Ukrainian armed forces are generally centers where Russian soldiers are concentrated. Russia, on the other hand, cannot make any gains as it targets civilian citizens and the energy infrastructure of settlements in Ukraine. Here lies the difference. Kiev is using this new military tactic on the southern front lines of Ukraine as well. Currently, on the Melitopol-Kherson front line, the Ukrainian defenders carried out serious offensive operations against the Russian military areas in the last 4 days. Dozens of military ammunition depots of the Moscow army in and around this area were blown up by Ukrainian forces. After the heavy losses in Makivka, the citizens living in Russia and the opposition under the Moscow administration went mad with anger. Now, with this latest Havrilivka-Drua scandal, the fire against the regime in Russia will grow much more. The progress of the war in this way raises question marks. Has the Ukrainian army reached a turning point? Will the war end in Russia's defeat? Let's evaluate the latest situations from a broad perspective together. In less than 2 months, the war in Ukraine will reach its first anniversary. The fact that Ukraine exceeded expectations, both in terms of the performance of its armed forces and the overall resilience of the Ukrainian nation, should be celebrated. While there is no doubt that the Kiev army was determined to fight, at the same time, by all indications, the stalemate in Putin and Moscow darkened the course of the war for Russia. This is now a war of attrition, and although on paper Moscow seems to have an advantage in terms of population and territory, other factors, namely the human factor and ammunition, may be decisive in the war. Contrary to the realist paradigm in political science, Ukraine has once again demonstrated in this war what a mobilized, free and patriotic people can achieve when their homes are attacked and their citizens killed. But the conflict between Ukraine and Russia is now quickly turning into a war of numbers. Simply put, this case is all about ammo, and the critical impact on this ammo applies to both the Russians and the Ukrainians. Praised Russian stockpiles are depleted at rates only Soviet-era planners could have foreseen in the event of all-out war against NATO. At the height of summer, when Moscow took a page from the Soviet playbook to replace a massive artillery hammer for maneuver, the Russians were firing about 60,000 rounds a day, sometimes even more. Today, the Russians can fire no more than 20,000 rounds a day on the battlefield, and sometimes even less than that. And the Moscow military is currently digging deep into its own remaining stocks to maintain even this limited rate. Meanwhile, Russia is entering into a worldwide contact to fill the shortage in ammunition supply. Moscow is trying to fill this ammo gap from Iran and North Korea. On the other hand, almost all of the ammunition stocks brought by Russia from Belarus seem to be depleted, and Russia's limited capacity to supply them raises the question of whether its military and industrial complex is capable of sustaining the Soviet style of warfare. Another problem facing Russia, as it prepares to train a new 300,000-strong strike force, possibly in preparation for another offensive, is that these new units will not even match the quality of the troops deployed in Ukraine last February. The Russian force created by General Valery Gerasimov's reforms has repeatedly proven incompatible with the traditional battlefield of attrition in Ukraine. The forces Russia has put on the ground since the Battle of Kiev were, and still are, inadequately trained and equipped in 2022. These Russian military groups lack trained professional top military personnel, and above all, Moscow is currently unable to deploy the most praised new Russian weapons platforms. Putin's new forces may suffer the same fate as the first and second military waves in this war. If this happens, the strategic breakthrough that Ukraine seeks will yield results much sooner, and the scale of the war will change. Thank you for watching us.